talk about why we use checklists, how to use checklists, and how do you use them for knowledge transfer, how you can then take the checklists that you create and input them into a CMMS, and how you mobilize those and distribute them across your organization. So why use checklists? There's a lot of reasons to use checklists, and Atul Gawande is a surgeon who wrote this book. And what he found is that there are a lot of mistakes that are made that can be prevented. And he uses a lot of different examples from the aeronautical industry, the medical industry, and we'll start to go through some of those as we continue. So good checklists are supposed to be precise, efficient, to the point. They're supposed to help you do your job. And they are not supposed to be 700 items long. They're supposed to be the important, critical things, and they should only do what's absolutely necessary. So why use checklists? There are two types of mistakes in the world. There's mistakes of ignorance, and there's mistakes of ineptitude. Mistakes of ignorance means you don't know how to do something. In the example here, in the 1950s, we didn't understand heart disease. So when people had heart problems, they tried to put them on bed rest. They tried to make them inactive. They didn't know how to handle it. Mistakes of ineptitude. That's when you understand how to do something, but you don't do it right anyway. So, and you can see, the great news about mistakes of ineptitude is they're fixed by process and procedure. In 2007, 72% of patients got the intervention within 90 minutes. Fast forward 4 years, and that increased to 94%. And that's because they operationalized the procedures that were required, so you got the great quality of care. And they did that through simple checklists to make sure that people did it correctly. They're easy to fix mistakes, but they are the worst type of mistakes. Because there's a word when you make a mistake based on ineptitude. Does anyone know what it is? It's called malpractice or negligence, meaning you are liable for the mistakes when you know how to handle something and you don't do it correctly. So how do you prevent it? It's pretty obvious. We're talking about checklists. Checklists help fill the gap when you should know how to handle something, but sometimes you forget. You're busy. There's a lot of steps. It's really easy to skip something. Creating a checklist and following a checklist help you move through the process and eliminate those types of mistakes. So the funny thing is, he says they can't be long. They have to be between 5 and 9 items because that's the working limits of your short-term memory. The interesting thing with that is he doesn't even follow his own advice. This is a checklist he made. What he did, though, is he broke out those checklists into sections. Each section is 5 to 9 items. And the way he handled this, he wanted all of them to be seen at once. We'll talk about benefits of one way versus the other later. This particular checklist had a dramatic improvement. It was very simple. And we should talk about the fact that there's 2 types of checklists. There's read, do, meaning you read the question, you understand it, you follow it, and then you do it and you mark your result. And then there's do, confirm, meaning I've done the work, and then I go to the checklist to say, yep, I did it, yep, I did it, yep, I did it. The do confirms typically require more than one person because you want to coordinate and make sure you actually did it correctly. The read do's are best utilized with one person. What's interesting about some of these checklists, and we'll talk about actually that example later. So the benefits. They ensure consistency. They're done the same way. There's a reason when we were kids, we all enjoyed going to McDonald's. Because McDonald's operationalized the checklist for building the burger, and it didn't matter which McDonald's you went to, you're going to get the same burger with the same quality. If you allow your engineers to operate differently, you're going to get different results. There was a great speaker yesterday, Dean, and he was talking about thinking. When you allow a human to think, they make mistakes. And it sounds bad, it sounds counterculture to everything we do, but realistically, if people are thinking on their own and they are not following your process or procedure, they have the capacity to introduce risk and mistake. You want to make sure that your way of doing things are done. As I mentioned, they're used to reduce failure. One of the important things to notice, though, is it aids in memory and attention. It does not mean checklists are for novices and we don't trust people. The checklists are actually for experts because you have to understand what's going on, and they help you make sure you don't skip a step. It's very, very simple, but it's very, very effective. And in that end, they serve as an informational aid. It's very easy to potentially forget a step. If you have to monitor 600 different types of assets, it's really easy to forget step 67 on one of those random assets. And so they serve as a reminder for how to do things. And you can make sure that everything is done to the same completeness at all times. This is a recipe for a cookie. If you forget one item on a checklist, you might as well not have used the checklist. If you do not follow the checklist to perform your work, you might as well not have the checklist. The reality is, if you forget an ingredient like sugar, your cookie's going to not taste very good. Every single thing should be critical. If your engineers end up skipping some of the questions every time, that's probably an indication that that question isn't necessary. The great thing about creating a checklist and forcing everyone to use it is you will get feedback. Your engineers will say, this needs to also have this step, or these 3 steps aren't necessary. And then you can make sure that everything is done the same way across the organization. I don't know anything about cookies, so I just took a picture. But as I mentioned, your engineers will tell you when your checklist is wrong and help you fix it. It seems counterculture that a checklist and a rigid process and forcing people to follow it will improve employee satisfaction. But the reality is, everyone wants to know when they're successful. And the best way to let people know when they're successful is to tell them how to do their job, tell them what their job is, and let them do it. And they can start to meet the expectations, and then they can know that they're succeeding. And so it actually improves employee morale. It also helps you feel organized because you know what you're supposed to do and when you're supposed to do it. I'm sure all of us have competing priorities. It would be very helpful, even to me, if I had a list that said, this is what the first thing and the most important thing for you to do, and do it in this order. I would be able to accomplish what I wanted to accomplish and finish the day. It improves morale in a lot of different ways. This is a simple one. This is Department of Energy, I believe. Implementing checklists within a PM program can increase asset lifespan by 25%. And it's because you make sure you do the right steps at all times. You don't skip any steps. So there are 4 main benefits to implementing checklists specifically within facilities maintenance. There's process reliability. We talked about that. Make sure you do the same thing the same way every single time. There's verifiable compliance. And this is kind of interesting because right now, if you do not capture the information, you don't have any way of being in compliance, whether it's with regulations, whether it's within your own programs, whether it's within any number of factors. Being able to say, I did these things and I followed the process helps to eliminate the liability. Operational insight. If you have a 10 checklist item and step 3 always has issues, it tells you that you may need to institute more training. It may tell you that you need to fix this type of part or process. When you can start to see information for each item in a checklist and do that via reporting, you gain the capacity to improve your organization. And allows you to capture best practice. Yeast is not a best practice for cookies. And it sounds obvious. Maybe it didn't sound obvious to me. That's because I'm not an expert in cooking. And so when you create these checklists, you want experts at the table, but what you want to do is create them, distribute them, run them through some test cases, and then start to roll them out in phases throughout the whole organization. Once you've done that, you will start to collect the feedback on it, and if you have to make changes, you'll make changes, and you'll make sure that you're doing it the best way possible. So I'm going to use some examples from 2 industries. They're from the book, and they're pretty powerful. This is the Boeing Model 299. You've probably never heard of this plane. Boeing was competing with another company, and they were running a test pilot in front of all the generals and admirals of the Army. And they had their absolute best fighter pilot at the time, Ployer P. Hill. He takes off. 52 seconds after he takes off, turns, crashes straight down. Him and two of the additional 5 people on board died. Before this point in time, everybody blamed people when a mistake was made. It wasn't the process, it wasn't the engineer, it wasn't the machinery. The person clearly made a mistake. It's a little hard to do if you have the absolute best fighter pilot in the Army crash a plane. So they sat back and Boeing got together and they created the very first aeronautical checklist. The plane was called Too Hard to Drive, Too Hard to Fly, an unflyable plane. They created the first checklist. The checklist was deployed. Since then, it flew over 1 million miles without a single incident. Later on, it became known as the B-17. To this day, Boeing uses checklists, and the aeronautical industry uses checklists at all times. In fact, they have a dedicated team to creating checklists for every potential scenario. Fast forward a whole bunch of years, several years back, there's a trans-Arctic flight, crashes. No one can figure out why. One smart engineer said, well, if the fuel froze, we wouldn't have been able to tell that by the time they crashed because it would have melted on the ground. So I think this is what caused it. And just for safety's sake, let's create a checklist on how to prevent this if it happens again. So they created a checklist. I don't know exactly how many steps there were. They labeled it correctly. They facilitated it. They distributed it. Fast forward a few more years. Another plane's flying trans-Arctic. All the engines shut off. They don't panic. They pull up their book. They say, I've heard about this. They flip to the section that says, what happens after a trans-Arctic flight when your engine shut off? And it was a hypothetical that said, your fuel might be frozen, so follow these 3 steps. They follow those 3 steps. No one ever heard about a crash because nothing ever happened. When you take the information, the mistakes, and the correct things that happens within your organization, and you institutionalize it, and you process that, and you make sure it's always followed, you reduce reliability. And in these cases, and in all of the cases for everyone who flew here, the reason you made it here is because they use checklists on every single flight. And again, I want to reemphasize, it's not just for novices. Pilots are trained. They have a lot of hours of time. The absolute best fighter pilot crashed that plane. You cannot get better humans all the time. Sometimes you have to get better processes. So this is one that Atul Gawande himself was part of a team to create a checklist. And this is a very interesting checklist, and it has ramifications for all of you. It was literally 5 questions, and they have central line infections. Infections are actually one of the biggest problems in hospitals with procedures. They reduced it from 10% down to 0 in virtually no time by instituting these 5 checklists. The number one most important thing they did is they empowered the nurses to tell the doctors, no, you cannot move forward because you didn't do this. It seemed so counterculture. Nurses were shy and timid, and they didn't like to do it when it was first deployed. Since then, it's been deployed all over the place, and many checklists are created like this now, where a junior person can stop a senior person based on them not following the checklist, and it's dramatically improved results. Well, this has a tie-in to what we do. How many of you have 100% lockout, tagout compliance? Raise your hand. Congratulations, there was one person who raised their hand. Your system should require lockout, tagout compliance. And if the engineer does not do it, it should be their fault and not yours. And so every single time someone does some work, they should be asked, did you do this? And if they say no, the work shouldn't be allowed to be completed. If they say yes and they lied, it's not, I'm not going to say you're not going to be in trouble, but the liability has been reduced for you and transferred to them because they explicitly lied about the process. So checklists can be one of the keys and fundamental ways to transfer knowledge across your organization. We talked about mistakes of ignorance versus ineptitude, and that mistakes of ineptitude are unforgivable and create liability because you should know how to complete those. The reality is, every single day we are bombarded with vast quantities of information. And if you expect every single engineer to keep track of all of that information in their head at all times, you are asking for problems. So using checklists is a way of distilling that vast quantity of information and making sure you can follow a process and procedure. Knowledge management is the intersection of intellectual capital, all of the vast quantity of information you have within your organization, especially in your baby boomers who are going to be retiring. The organizational culture, how that information is spread and shared throughout the organization, and the information technology. How do you operationalize the knowledge that exists within your organization? There are both explicit and implicit. I've talked a lot about checklists, but that doesn't mean that's the only way. There's training, there's documentation, following other procedures, creating those type of things. There's storytelling, simulation. Simulation's very, very useful. And it's one of the most underutilized ways of training and ways of sharing information. In football, they practice a whole summer. They practice weeks. They only play for 3 hours. Or 1 hour, but it feels like it's the 3-hour game. They only play for 1 hour. There's a lot of training that goes into making sure things are done correctly. And simulation is a great way to do that. This is the one that should scare everybody. When an employee walks out the door, 70% of the information he knows about your organization and his job leaves with him. I'm seeing a couple head shakes. I think everyone realizes this, but it's hard to capture that information, and checklists are one of the ways you do that, specifically in the engineering discipline. This is a scary one. Approximately 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day. Approximately 20 or 30 to 50% of the workforce is retiring in the next 5 to 6 years. In the next 2 years, millennials will make up 50% of your workforce. Engineering may be a little bit behind that curve, but this is true across society. And you have to figure out ways of engaging millennials and training them in a discipline that has not been very millennial friendly. So how do you apply checklists within a solution to make that better? Again, it's very important that when you apply a checklist to a solution that you don't create extra steps. You need to figure out what are the absolute minimum steps that guarantee success and implement it that way. So this is an inspection of an air handling unit. You've all probably have reports like this. And how many of you are paper-based where you track your reports this way? I see some very timid hands like this, like I don't want to admit it. It's no shame. Most of the operations still function this way if they track it on paper and it's not just in somebody's head. The way to do it correctly is to take it, put it in software, and mobilize it. And the reason that I think that this is crucial is if you put it on paper, someone has to transpose that information into a system, and there's opportunities for mistakes there, including losing the sheet of paper, never having the information, pencil whipping, and all of those types of things. Mobilizing your checklist can do lots of things like proof of presence with barcode scanning, lockout tag compliance, and those type of things. So as we talk about that, I'd literally take that first question. Are there signs of excessive pitting, rusting, or corrosion? Yes or no? Yes, no questions. How many people do most of your checklists are yes, no, or okay, true, false, those type of questions? About half, yeah. I mean, I know there's other types, but I mean, I think when you look at it, the majority of questions we tend to find with most people are of this type. They don't provide a lot of information. Instead, you can do things like, no, the condition is operable. No, it needs repair. Yes, with an explanation, or yes, requires follow-up. Now, these are just sample questions. You can usually configure any CMMS the way you want. But what you want to start to do is, does it take any more time to circle yes versus click one of those? It doesn't take any more time, but now you have detailed information you can report on and improve your process with. Notes required. If notes aren't even written on paper, how often do those get transferred into a system effectively? What you want is when a question is asked and notes are necessary, allow the question to dictate that I need a note, I need the information, and I need you to capture it now and put it into the system. I don't know how to bake, right? I don't know yeast shouldn't be in cookies. I also don't know much about what does excessive mean. I'm a new guy. I just started in this industry. What is the definition of excessive? Your checklist should, for the expert, should allow them to complete their job. For those who don't know, there should be additional information that's exposed to say, this is what excessive means in our organization. This is what the 1 to 5 scale means. This is how you rate things. This is how you do things. Your checklist should contain the information and your processes that are necessary for success. Requires follow-up. This is a simple one. How many work orders are actually completed that say, this is in terrible shape, and that just gets shuffled, filed, and forgotten about? It's terrible. You're literally saying, this needs to be fixed, and it just disappears, and it's hidden. Your CMMS, your solution, however you do this, when a problem is found, it needs to be fixed. And if it's not the right person, if this person can't do it, the answers should dictate, schedule somebody else with more knowledge to come out and fix this. Ticking those boxes isn't the goal. Creating a culture that says, I care about my facility, I care about my organization, and I want us to be successful, and my department is going to help do that, is the goal. And the best way to do that is with good checklists. So I mentioned it earlier, but you shouldn't gamble with lockout tagout. It's the biggest liability you guys have on a day-to-day basis for your staff is if they do not follow the lockout tagout steps. And no matter what system or process you use, you should organizationally require it. Of everyone in the room, one person said they felt comfortable they had 100% lockout tagout compliance. I personally believe the best way for you to do this is to capture information in real time on a mobile device. You eliminate transcription errors, you eliminate errors of lost data, you capture that data, you can expose better types of information. Yes, no's are one of the reasons they were so popular is they were easy to do, or checkbox. They're easy to do on a sheet of paper on a report. We have better technology today. We all have iPhones or Androids or Blackberries in our pockets. We should be utilizing modern technology to run our organizations the most effective way we can. So we need to build the checklist.